why for weightlifters cluster sets could be useful?
It depends on your philosophy of training, first off. If you're going to do high volume training, so in some schools of thought, for example, Professor Kyle Pierce with Kendrick Ferris is very well documented that he uses sets of 10 during certain periods of the year. Professor Mike Stone is the same out of the United States, and there is some notation that the Germans do this as well. You generally believe that high volume sets in the weightlifting movements, the snatch and the clean and jerk, power snatch, power clean, etc., you see technical degradation across the set. The more fatigue you get, the higher the volume. So what we could do is use the cluster set to maintain the technique. Now, my doctoral student, Yoshi Nagatani, has done some research in our lab that has shown that we can maintain technique with the cluster set across a high volume set of power snatches. Similarly, a young researcher named Hardy out of Appalachian State University showed that you could maintain technique in sets of 6 in the power clean.
Hi, Greg. It's my pleasure to have you in Evidence Strong Show. If you could briefly introduce yourself, that would be great.
My name is Professor Greg Haff. I am the professor of strength conditioning at Edith Cowan University. I do research on strength, power, weightlifting, and program design, things in those spaces, all centered around making people stronger and more efficient athletes. I've been the president of the National Strength and Conditioning Association and have been in that organization for over 25 years and am accredited in multiple countries. I'm a level 3 weightlifting coach in Australia, but also in the United States. So I've got extensive experience coaching weightlifting at a high level. I was a weightlifter when I was younger competitively. I do it still now, but I wouldn't consider myself very good anymore. But I do enjoy investigating performance. I do a lot of my work in weightlifting. It's been with women's weightlifters, actually. I tend to have a lot of interest in helping females become optimized for competition. And I enjoy coaching still. So I still coach today, even though I'm a busy academic with a research program. I still coach about 15 to 20 hours a week.
That sounds impossible. How do you do it?
My wife and I, we just enjoy doing what we do, and we don't have kids, but we have athletes that we spend a lot of time with and try to develop as athletes, but we find we're spending a lot more time developing them as people these days than we did previously. It seems that they need a little bit more support to handle the world as it is these days. But I think it's just because we enjoy it. A lot of what I have in my life is because I was a weightlifter. All my professional development are from contacts I met as a lifter, and the scientists that were testing me when I was a junior weightlifter in the US have become my friends and helped me study, mentored me, and guided my career to where it is today.
Awesome. So our topic today is cluster sets, and let's start with explaining what these are.
So when we look at cluster sets, there's a really rich history in what cluster sets are. In fact, we can actually look back to 1949, where the first incarnations of the cluster set were talked about by a guy named Charles Ross in Iron Man magazine. And it was referred to as this kind of concept of a rest pause method. So basically what Ross suggested was you're going to do 10 repetitions and you're going to have a 3 to 5 breath rest in between each rest. And we think that's kind of where cluster sets began. And then over time, Perry Rader in 1958 in Iron Man magazine started to talk about putting 8 to 10 seconds in between reps for sets of 7 to 8. And it was always referred to as the rest pause method. It wasn't until Yuri Verkhoshansky and several others in the 1970s and 80s started talking about it as what we call a cluster set today. So the rest pause method actually has a rich history. In fact, in weightlifting in the 1950s, there's no notation in Iron Man magazine of US weightlifters doing a push press every minute on the minute for an hour. It's kind of like a cluster set, but I wouldn't classify an EMOM as a cluster set because the rest interval is too long. So for us, a cluster set in the definitions, we start with the one from Yuri Verkhoshansky, is somewhere around 20 to 30 seconds rest in between individual repetitions within a set or groups of repetitions in a set. So we can modify the set structure. What's really, really interesting, in the 1970s, a famous weightlifting coach in the United States named Carl Miller actually used cluster sets in the preparation of the U.S. Olympic team in 1976 leading into the Olympic Games as part of the tapering process. So it was in the actual getting ready for competition part of the training program, and where they actually interspersed individual repetitions with about 30 seconds rest. Now, today, based on our research, we can use multitudes of rest intervals. We tend to believe it should be around 15 seconds to about 45 max. The length of that rest interval can dictate the physiological adaptive response or the recovery response. So we can actually use it to either drive a change in the physiology, maintain mechanics, which is the big part of with weightlifting is we want to always lift with efficient movements. If we are fatigued, we'll see a change in the barbell trajectory and our basic movement mechanic. So we can use it in higher volume in the general prep, but we could also use it in the preparation for competition, and we can manipulate the cluster set to basically model different things or stimulate different adaptations.
So let's bring it together. Why, for weightlifters, cluster sets could be useful?
It depends on your philosophy of training, first off. If you're going to do high volume training, so in some schools of thought, for example, Professor Kyle Pierce with Kendrick Ferris is very well documented that he uses sets of 10 during certain periods of the year. Professor Mike Stone is the same out of the United States, and there is some notation that the Germans do this as well. You generally believe that high volume sets in the weightlifting movements, the snatch and the clean and jerk, power snatch, power clean, etc., you see technical degradation across the set. The more fatigue you get, the higher the volume. So what we could do is use the cluster set to maintain the technique. Now, my doctoral student, Yoshi Nagatani, has done some research in our lab that has shown that we can maintain technique with the cluster set across a high volume set of power snatches. Similarly, a young researcher named Hardy out of Appalachian State University showed that you could maintain technique in sets of 6 in the power clean. So we could maintain technique, but still get high volumes or a higher density of training, which can cause specific neuromuscular adaptation. So that's one reason we can use the cluster set. The second reason is we can actually use it to model situations that we may get into in competition. So for example, if someone moves out of the way and you have to go at a quicker pace than you're planning, sometimes that puts an athlete under stress because they're used to having a longer recovery period in the prep for competition. So for us, we tend to use, for example, an ascending cluster set. Let's say I'm going to do 3 repetitions with a 30 seconds rest in between each repetition, with each rep going up in load. That can actually be very beneficial for helping the athlete prepare for a situation where they have to go on a faster turnaround than they expect. Now, we could also create a wave structure where one set is ascending, the next set is ascending, and the next set is ascending with clusters. And we believe that the second set will begin with a faster velocity and get a post-activation potentiation performance enhancement. The data is not as clear as we'd like to see. We have some that suggest that it will, some that suggest it won't. I think it depends on the loading. And we still haven't dialed in on the loading with that basic structure yet from a science.
All right. So do you want to now go through the types?
When you talk about the types of cluster sets, one of the things you have to realize is that how you structure the cluster set can actually be very important to consider when you're designing a training program, because if you are trying to stimulate some specific adaptation or you're going to try to model some sort of situation, you've got to match that cluster set structure to the actual program design that you're trying to target. Now, if we start with the basics, the traditional set is going to be continuous reps, and we just go one rep after another. And I think everyone in weightlifting knows that pretty well. And generally, most weightlifting coaches with strength-based exercises use sets of 5 as the max reps. Most use sets of 3 in the clean and jerk as max reps, that you would do sets of 4 maybe with the snatch. And that's a generality because there are different schools of thought. And then we have some sort of rest interval between sets. That rest interval between sets is somewhere between 2 and 3 minutes on average when you look at elite weightlifters. If you just time them and let them go at their own pace, most fall around 2 minutes. With weightlifters, that as you get closer to a competition, you get them closer to a 2-minute turnaround between sets, even though the loads are higher. If you think about it, if you're going to follow yourself in a competition, it's going to be on a 2-minute clock. So it's probably best to prepare for that. So a traditional set, we're going to have that 2-minute rest to 3 minutes rest between sets, no rest between individual repetitions. So a standard cluster set, one of the hallmarks of a cluster set is the rest between sets is going to stay the same as a traditional set. So what we're doing is interspersing more rest into the actual set. So if we're going to do cluster sets of 1, and what I mean by 1, that means 1 rep, slight rest, 1 rep, slight rest for the duration of the set. And that's called a traditional set. And what we'll do there is we'll put a rest interval there. We'll keep the load the same. So the concept there is that we're going to be able to move the barbell with more velocity on each repetition, maintain vertical displacement of the barbell, which is well documented in the cluster set literature, and maintain technique. And so that's probably the base cluster set. And that can be used in pretty much any phase or any period of training. The second one is called an undulating. I actually don't like the term undulating, but Professor Stone called it that. I think it's more of a pyramidal structure. So let's say we're going to do a set of 5. We're going to keep our rest between sets the same, but we're going to put a 30-second rest in between each individual repetition. But on the second rep of a set of 5, the weight's going to go up. On the third rep of the set, the weight's going to go up again. And then on the fourth rep, it's going to go down. And then the fifth rep, it's going to go back down to what the first rep is. So it's a pyramid in reality, but it's called undulating within the literature. Well, this has got some benefit too, because what it does is it allows you to go up. You get a big stimulus on the third rep, but then you will move with a faster velocity on reps 4 and 5 because of post-activation potentiation enhancement. Now, it also allows us to deal with fatigue. If we are becoming fatigued, lowering the load can optimize the actual performance as well. So that's another one that we use quite frequently. That one is typically used in the competition period as you're working up to a set, coming back down. Could be simulation of what we have going on where we're warming up and then something changes and we have to go back down a little bit. We can do some things there. Then we have what's called ascending sets, where across the set, the weight goes up with each repetition. We will still use, let's say, a 30-second rest in between reps. So that we can go up. And then we'll come back to the next set, start at the bottom again and go back up again. The idea here is that the early reps in the second set should move at a higher velocity from the stimulus of the conditioning from the first set. And most weightlifters will say that they feel like they're moving quicker. It's very similar to a wave set structure that weightlifters do commonly, where they have one set at one load, next set at a higher load, next set at a higher load, and then go back down again. But we're doing it within the actual individual set a little bit. Then we have descending cluster sets, or one that we're playing with, where the first set is the highest, rep is the highest, and then the weight goes down across the set. Ideally, this is to deal with managing fatigue, but also maybe some performance enhancement at the repetitions. We haven't done any research on descending cluster sets. So this is one we've just played with in the lab and tried to figure out, can we do it? How would we structure it? But we published nothing, and I have no data to actually share. Those are probably the main ones that we typically use, with the last one being a wave one, where in the cluster we'll go low, high, low, high, low, high. So every other rep, the weight is either going up or down. And that kind of models that wave structure, again, that weightlifters are very commonly using in their training. Now, one of the beauties of a cluster set, the base cluster set model, is individual repetitions with rest intervals between them, but you can change that. You can actually do, for example, let's say we're doing a set of 6. We could do 2 reps, 30 seconds rest, 2 reps, 30 seconds rest, 2 reps. So we can change the basic fatigue pattern there. So we could get higher volume. For example, we might do Yoshi's research at the moment. He's doing sets of 9 and total reps, but they're clustered into groups of 3. So you get some stimulus like you would normally with traditional training, get a little rest, and what we're seeing is technique is being maintained. And we're looking at that with statistical parametric mapping to kind of show where in the curve the change is when we become fatigued and where we're maintaining it. So I think the cluster set has a lot of ability to be manipulated to change the stimulus. The vast majority of the research has been on individual repetitions with rest between them within the set. There is a little bit of high volume research by my former doctoral student, Dr. James Tufano, as part of his dissertation, where we did sets of 12 in the back squat, and we did clusters of 4, so 4 reps, 30 seconds, 4 reps, 30 seconds, etc., for a total of 12 repetitions. Now, one of the things about a cluster set that people need to realize is that most of the research will equalize the load. So if I do 100 kilos for, a set of 5 power cleans, the cluster set would just be putting rest in between each individual repetition with the same load, because they're trying to equalize the load and say the rest interval is the difference. I actually think that's a mistake in the research, because one of the things that we know from the cluster set practical experience that we have as coaches is that we can handle a much higher load with the cluster set. So we could get a greater stimulus if we equalize the load based on percentage of RM. What I mean by that is, if I am going to do a set of 5 and I do 80% of my 5 RM, and I do, let's say I'm going to do individual reps and I do 80% of my individual rep, we actually see that you can actually get the same velocity loss across the set with the higher load with the cluster set. So you can do more work with the same basic fatigue across the set. We think that's the main benefit of a cluster set, is the ability to tolerate and handle higher loads with this short rest interval. And I think that's going to stimulate some different adaptive responses. One of the areas we're really interested in right now is hypertrophy. And we think that high volume cluster sets can actually maximize strength and also allow us to stimulate hypertrophy. We're starting to look at cell signaling and acute responses to that. Now, one of the things that I would suggest is that would only be in the general prep phase. It gives us more work density in a smaller unit of time. So there are a lot of ways to manipulate the cluster set, but those are the basic structures that we use.
Would you have any comments on rest that can be used and how it will influence the outcomes?
Absolutely. So the shorter the rest, the more strength endurance we're going to focus on. So obviously 0 rest in a set of 5, you're going to do 5 reps, will have a degree of fatigue. And we see that typically with weightlifters. They start to degrade sometimes across the set of 5 in, let's say, the clean. By putting 15-second rest in there, that's a little bit of rest, get a little bit of recovery. We return some of our peak force generating capacity pretty quickly. And we see a maintenance of performance. Now, the maximum rest that we use is 45 seconds. We use 45 seconds. We have a pretty good amount of recovery and we can maintain performance quite well. We can use the rest interval in between there in different ways. Now, I know Yoshi kind of aligned it with different repetition schemes with his understanding or his thought processes with the cluster set. For example, he was suggesting if you have individual reps, it's going to be somewhere between 15 and 25 seconds. 2 reps in the cluster, 20 to 30, 3 reps, 25 to 35, any reps between 4 and 6, somewhere between 30 and 40 seconds. That's a rough estimate. I don't think those rules are set in stone, but that could get you in a nice target space and where you could actually align yourself as far as, the rep to rest ratio. I think the biggest challenge that you have is that the cluster set extends the length of time for that actual exercise. And I think that's something that has to be accounted for in the training program. And I think sometimes people shy away from the cluster set because of that increased time.
Are there any tips to combat that?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, when we look at the cluster set and its implementation into a training program, the first thing I always tell everyone is that you don't use it for every exercise. There's no point in doing that. You use it for specific exercises. From a weightlifting perspective, I like cluster sets for anything that's done from the floor as far as like a clean, a snatch, power clean, power snatch. That works really well. If it's done from blocks at the knee or the thigh, you could use a cluster set as well. You generally don't use cluster sets from a hang because you have to put the bar down, pick it up, and it just increases more work. Now, we have used it with, for example, jerks, but that's from jerk blocks where you just stand up and jerk and then drop it. That works well as well. Now, our research we've done in the squat, but we have to account for the extra time to rack and unrack the bar because you don't want to stand holding the load because that's just going to magnify fatigue. So that's the first thing we have to think about is the exercise that we choose. The other thing that we can do and what can actually in a team sport kind of environment or a multiple athlete sport environment, we can do what my wife, Coach Haff, has come up with, and I take no credit for it. This is her brainchild, and it's a genius idea, actually, is that we do partner cluster sets. So let's say you and I lift the same load. I'm going to do 2 reps in the power clean, then you do 2 reps, then I do 2 reps, then you do 2 reps. So your reps become my rest interval. And so what her theory was, and we actually like it in our lab, is that helps us build team dynamics so that we can work together. And in the strength and conditioning environment, that's an important thing. But it also auto-regulates the timing without having to actually sit there with a stopwatch. Now, if I want to lengthen the time, we could have 3 people working together. And the 2 people that are resting could change the weight on the barbell. So you can actually get some of those more advanced cluster set structures into the actual training that way. So the partner cluster is something that we think is pretty interesting from an idea. I have no research on it because it's really a coach application of the actual concept. But from a theoretical perspective, it works, perfectly fine. And we've used it with team sport athletes for the last decade or so. But generally what we do is we only pick 1 or 2 exercises in the session that we want a cluster set with, the ones that are our primary, most important training foci. Usually it's a weightlifting exercise. It could be a derivative, a pulling motion. If we're trying to maximize pulling strength, we might use it there. It just depends on what we're trying to do. But the rest of the sets should probably be traditional because traditional sets have a great stimulus they do generate fatigue, but we know fatigue is sometimes necessary to actually stimulate adaptation.
Awesome. And can we go now into how to use the cluster sets in different phases of training?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple ways that you can look at it. It's when I always think about training programs, and I think this is probably the most important thing in any training program, is to figure out what your targeted output or adaptation that you're trying to get. What are you trying to get out of your training program? And I think if you could do that, then that gives you an idea of where you're trying to go and it helps you guide your decisions. One of the things I like to do is create decision trees and say, I want to do this. Can my athlete do that? Yes. If no, no. If yes, do this. If no, do that. And so for us, when we start to look at cluster set, what we try to do is align with what we're trying to stimulate. So if we're in a general prep phase, we're really trying to build a base. And again, this comes back to your weightlifting philosophy. So, in some schools of thought, this could be using sets of 10 in the support exercises like squatting, pulling derivatives, pushing derivatives, and sets of 5 in the lifts. Now, I could use a cluster set there. I would probably use a traditional flat loaded cluster set where the load is actually the same throughout. I might also consider using different repetitions. For example, if I'm going to do 10, I could do singles, or I could break it up for more conditioning and do doubles and have a little bit more work condensed into a cluster. If I really wanted to have stress, I could go 5, 30 seconds, 5, and that could be done to actually push the athlete. So in the higher volume ones, my goal is to basically have a greater work capacity stimulus and get specific kinds of adaptations. Obviously, the loads will be lower because of the higher volumes, etc. So I generally do that. Now, I have used ascending clusters in the preparation phase with some athletes, but those are the ones that have very, very, very solid technique, because if the load's going up across the set of 9, let's say, by the 9th rep, it's getting hard. The technique's going to break because of the volume, but also the load going up. So I've got to be cognizant of that. Now, when I'm getting into like a strength focused phase, obviously we're going to bring the repetitions down. The loads are going to be higher. Ascending clusters are great there. Traditional clusters are great there. The number of reps in the cluster come down so that we can get more high quality work with higher loads. And obviously we're going to try to use the higher loading. We may also use the undulating in that phase as well. Go up to a high load, come back down, do that for each set, because I'm trying to touch higher weights during the strength phase to kind of maximize strength. As I get closer to competition, I might actually use ascending clusters to simulate going up, 1, 2, 3 with a close density. I know when I lifted back in the 90s, Professor Stone wasn't uncommon for me to do cleans at 160, 165, 170 with like a 30 seconds rest in between each repetition, and do that for 3 to 4 sets. And so you get a lot of density of training. So I think what you have to look at is the nexus of what the goal is, the structure of the set. Is it ascending, descending, wave, flat loaded, and the manipulation of the rest interval, and also the loading. So when we have individual rep, we tend to, in our group, work off of the 1RM. So if I'm going to do 80% of 1RM, boom, 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 boom. If we're going to do a set of cluster of 2, we work off of the estimated 2RM. We're going to do clusters with 3s in them, we work off of the estimated 3RM. And that gives us loading that is aligned with the reps that we're doing. And I think that works pretty well. So we're aligning it to the targeted outcome and the phase of training. Now, so one of the things I think where cluster sets may be quite beneficial is with novices who are trying to learn technique. So you could actually use a repetition, rest, so that the quality of the repetitions is a little bit better. But it may also give you opportunity for coaching feedback or instruction in between the repetitions. But that has to be done judiciously. You don't want to overwhelm the athlete with cognitive load in between reps. So that could be one place that some people have suggested the cluster set may have some benefit, to have these little shorter kind of like bouts of exercise where it's a little bit higher quality. So that's kind of how I think of cluster sets sometimes, is it's about having higher quality work within the set. So when I mean higher quality, it could be, we could be lifting higher loads, we could be moving at higher velocities, we could be maintaining better technique. So how I structure that cluster set could impact either any one of them, depending on the decisions that I make. And the decisions that I can make are the structure of the cluster set, as far as, is it an undulating, traditional, ascending, descending, wave, etc. The loads that I choose, what am I working off of? Am I working off of the total number of repetitions, or are I working off of the number of repetitions in the actual cluster, and then the exercise that I choose to use it with? All of those decisions can create different responses, and how I structure it could actually create, a different performance benefit. So I think there's a lot of scope for creativity and actual kind of creating novelty for the actual athlete within their training stimulant, which I think is beneficial. Now, obviously, whenever we're training, we're balancing variability and stability. We don't want to vary the cluster set so much every time that we put stability at risk and not get adaptation. But we have to think structurally what we're trying to accomplish and be somewhat focused in the targeted outcome that we're really trying to address.
So would you be open to go through maybe one example of how you would thinking through how to use cluster set, why, and how then implement training?
So the first thing I'll do is look at the period or phase of training. So for me, obviously I have preparation phase, competition phase, peaking per se, am I building a foundation, or am I maximizing strength, and then am I translating it into performance? So the phase is going to dictate my choices. So if I look at the prep phase is more about work capacity, building, the foundation from which to build strength. So in that phase, the first thing I'll do is figure out how many exercises I'm going to do, traditional programming decisions. Obviously, the vast majority of the set structures used for the vast majority of the exercises would be traditional sets, because fatigue is important for some aspects. But let's say I'm going to use clusters. Like I might, for example, let's say I'm going to do a complex of a power clean plus a front squat, and I'm going to do that for a total of 9 repetitions. So power clean, front squat, that's 1 repetition. And I want to do a total of 9. I could actually do 3 reps, even make a decision to do 3 reps, rest 25 to 35 seconds, do 3 reps, 25 to 35 seconds, 3 reps. And that gives me a total of 9 repetitions. So the 3 decisions that I've made there is the vast majority of my session is traditional. This one is my technical exercise. So I'm going to want some volume. So 3s is a pretty challenging effort. I want some rest to maintain technique and allow me to accomplish that task. And so now I choose what kind of cluster. I'm going to say I'm going to use a traditional cluster set where I'm going to keep the weight the same for every rep, because at this stage of the athlete's annual training plan, they probably don't have the fitness for something more complex. And so I'll just use the traditional one there and keep the load flat. So that would be a decision that I would make for like base building or preparation. Now, when I'm trying to maximize strength, my decisions become a little bit different. I might actually think about this in a more structured way, focused on the actual Olympic lifts, the development of those. For example, I might say, all right, I'm going to do a clean session. I want the clean and jerk to be clustered. So I'm going to do maybe singles, really 80% for every rep or higher. So I could choose to do a traditional one if I just want to work on stability of technique with a load within a certain range. If I want to challenge the athlete, I could basically say simple and go ascending with the same loads in each set, but I could get creative and go up, come back down, go up higher on the second set, come back down, go up higher on the third set. And that gives me kind of that wave loading structure that's very common in weightlifting when we're trying to prepare them for competition, to allow them the ability to be able to go back down and re-warm up in the competition environment when the board changes or strategies change. And that can really be quite beneficial, because sometimes an athlete will touch a heavy weight, it'll be a little bit shaky in training. They go a little bit lower, they get it, they nail it, their confidence come back, and then they go up a little bit more, and then they hit it, and then again you kind of get this touch a heavy weight, come back, train, touch a heavy weight, come back, train. And we could do that on the microscopic scale within the set with the ascending clusters across the various sets. So if that's my decision to do that, that's got a lot of benefit, because it actually helps them maintain technique with higher loads. It helps them be exposed to higher loads, and it could have a psychological effect of building confidence, because they're touching the weight, then they come back and something feels easy. And so we could use that there. Now, in the peaking phase, the whole object is to try to get to the highest loads that you can. So those ascending clusters are often are the go-to there. But again, it's a lot of it's about thinking about what that individual athlete needs. I'm really big on looking at your individual athlete, saying, all right, what does the prescription that this athlete needs to maximize their performance? Every lifter on our team gets an individualized program that targets their specific weaknesses and developing their needs. I'm not a big fan of whole squads of weightlifters getting the same exact training program, because that goes on the false assumption that everybody has the same technical needs and same strength deficits.
Do you have any last comments on reps, set, rests, and exercise selection?
I think for me, when I start to think about exercise selection, I think that's a good place to kind of talk for a minute. One of the things that you have to think about is the exercises that you most commonly use cluster sets with. So the ones that have the highest potential for benefit are going to be your snatch and your clean, obviously. And that could be done from the floor or the block. And that gives you the ability to maintain technique. And I think that's, for a weightlifter, that's really important. I might throw the jerk in there if they are done from the block. If they're done not from the blocks, you've got racking, re-racking issues that create fatigue that you got to account for. If you're going to do things with racking or unracking, such as the squat or the jerk without blocks, you just have to use a longer rest interval. You have to account for the actual capacity to do that. The derivatives can also have benefits. For example, the power clean and the power snatch from the floor or the blocks. I think those could be beneficial, and the push jerk, push press if done from the blocks. And then we could look at the pulling derivatives from various heights could have benefits. Those are generally the high potential ones. The other one could potentially be the deadlift, the clean grip or snatch grip deadlift. There's some research there if you want to maximize strength. So I think those are the high potential. The moderate potential for me is really going to be the squatting motion, the back squat from various positions, front squat from various positions, bench pressing from various positions. Generally, I know Yoshi in his paper talked about hang derivatives. I would use hang derivatives with my athletes just because you've got to pick it up before you do it, unless you pick it off blocks, and then go, but why not just do it from the blocks then? So for me, that's kind of how I select the exercises. When I start to think about, exercises and phases, that you just go back to your traditional weightlifting programming. Where do you put certain exercises? Obviously, earlier in the training cycle leading into a competition, it's going to be more derivative focus, more squatting focus, less full lift focus. And as you get closer to competition, that changes, where we go to more of the full lifts and really less of the actual strength building exercises. And so that stays the same. It's pretty much everything else that's the same, but where we change is at the individual set or each exercise. I think that's something that we could think about there. And that probably is the main benefits and the main structures there in alignment. There's, a lot of scope for coaches to actually be creative. And I think that's something I would want to emphasize, but you don't want to get so creative that you don't get stimulus. So it's not random stuff for random stuff. It's having a rationale for every decision that you make. There is one other place that cluster sets are critically important is with the use of weight releasers. So we do a lot with weight releasing. So what I mean by weight releasers is that we're going to accentuate the eccentric phase of the lift. So for example, I'm going to squat. I have the weight releaser on the barbell with, let's say, 20% more load than what's on the barbell. And when we hit the bottom position of the squat, the weight releaser releases, and then we stand up. We re-rack, and then we put the weight releaser back on, and we do another rep. So fundamentally, that's a cluster set. Mm-hmm. And those have a lot of benefit for maximizing strength. And so we do that with our athletes as well. Now, there are a lot of ways you can do cluster sets with weight releasers. You can do it on every single repetition, or let's say I have 2 reps is in my cluster. The first rep is accentuated. The second rep is not. It's just a traditional squat. Then rest 20, 30 seconds, put the weight releaser back on, do the next set of 2, and so forth. That's another example. Or we could extend it out to even sets of 3 and 4 with the first rep having the weight releaser on. There seems to be some benefit with that. Weight releasers have become quite popular right now in strength development for weightlifters. We do it on our team. I know Professor Mike Stone does it on his team. Dr. Guy Hornsby at West Virginia University uses weight releasers with his team. And Paul Comfort and I have done some pilot work on some studies that we're trying to design. It's tricky to kind of analyze them because when that load releases, it makes the force time tracing a little bit difficult to interpret, but we're working through that. Another piece of advice for coaching and even application of any resistance training construct is what you see on social media sometimes may not be what you should do. Just because someone can do it doesn't mean it should be done. I think you have to kind of look at what you're trying to do and why. And the basics done really, really well will actually be beneficial 99.9% of the time. It's when you have to do some of these slight modifications to actually give a different stimulus to the athlete where you might get some more benefit. And I think cluster sets are kind of, for me, in that basics, it's something we've known about for, since the 40s, maybe earlier. And it's something that has been working in weightlifting for a very, very long time. And I think weightlifting coaches who are cognizant of the past of the sport and know where we've been are aware of that. I think some of the younger coaches aren't as much because, they don't really always spend the time looking at the training methods of the weightlifters from the 1950s or the 1960s. Because a lot of the things that were done then are, now on social media, the greatest in vogue thing ever, like isometrics and all that. Isometrics were used by the York Barbell team in the 1950s. York Barbell sold a functional isometric rack, and Bob Hoffman wrote a book on it. How to use isometrics for weightlifting. Not new. Cluster sets, not really new. Our understanding of what they do is new, but not the application.
Awesome. 2 short questions to finish. The first one is, what is your favorite color?
Probably black or red. I like dark colors.
And the second question, where people can find you on the internet if they want to follow your work or contact you for some advice?
So I do have a LinkedIn page. I also have Twitter, or is it X or whatever they call it now, doc_Haff. And then my Instagram is the same, doc_Haff. I'm in those 2 locations. And at the moment, I'm at Edith Cowan University. And that's where most people find me, is via my email there. Social media or there works fine. Or you can find me at, weightlifting education courses somewhere. I do a lot of those. And I do travel a lot for conferences. And I'm around, always happy to talk about weightlifting and strength training. I think it's a passion of mine, and I'd like to share information about, what we do.
All right, Greg, thank you so much for today. And I hope to see you next time when new publications come out.
Yeah, we've got a lot coming down the pipeline, and there's a few cluster sets ahead of press. And if Yoshi finishes up some more of his work in the next year, there should be a bunch next year. He's got a lot of creative stuff coming out that we're pretty excited about in our lab.
Awesome. Thank you, and see you next time.